how full is my own cup? How full is my own cup? How well resourced am I? And even developing a self-awareness within myself of where if my bandwidth is lower, then I can't expect as much out of myself. Naming the emotional impact that caring about others, caring about ourselves, caring about the world has is such a strong and needed starting point, because from there we can start building not only self-awareness, but a self-compassion for ourselves.
Welcome on the Joyful Mate podcast. How are you, Liz Moyer?
Oh, I'm so good. I'm feeling joyful. So thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad you're feeling joyful. That's the purpose of this podcast. And there's no doubt you're going to help the listeners discover more joy, happiness, and fulfillment in their life today. So before we get into our discussion around emotional health, I would love for you to share your backstory as to how you have ended up doing the amazing work you do today.
Yeah, it very much is rooted in my own relationship with my emotions. So I identify as a feeler, an empath, a sensitive soul. And so my inner world has always played a really big role in how I experience the outer world, and needing to get really clear about where my inner world ends and the outer world begins. And it was actually the first time that I learned about extreme poverty in college that set me on a path of sustainable development and social impact. So think international nonprofits and the UN system. And I remember it so clearly. I was sitting on my campus quad and I was reading a mandatory reading about extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And this just surge of emotional energy took over my body. And I thought to myself, I was like, whoa. Because since then I was on a path of psychology, on a path of neuroscience. I've always had a knack for connecting with people and listening, I'm the type of person who I'm sitting on the subway next to someone and they start telling me their life story kind of a thing, which is always such an honor. But it was in that moment that I had this realization. I was like, wow, if I can actually channel this emotional energy into something, then I think I could be of service. I think I could be onto something. And so flash forward now almost 20 years later, I've worked in the more traditional international development, sustainable development, social impact field. And it was during my time working in nonprofit settings, working with other fellow change makers and people who are just showing up and trying to be of service, that I really saw a gap in the field, and even a gap in terms of just acknowledging the impact that caring about the world has on our hearts, has on our minds, has on our sense of self. And so it was about 8 years ago that I left my 9 to 5 and pivoted to really start exploring that gap and exploring this term that I had more of a felt sense of than I really had a crystallized understanding of it. And it was collective healing. What does healing have to do at the collective level? Or what does healing centered tools, or even healing that I had been on my own personal journey around within my life, the things that I was learning, how can that help or assist culture change or these conversations around social change? And so for the last 8 years, I've been building out a body of work called We Heal for All, which has really been a container and a space to do that experimentation. And I support people who are done grieving the world alone and ready to find their place and changing it through just the healing centered sciences and what we know about how emotions work in the mind and body. And it's been a real privilege and joy to get to do so, because I believe we live in a day and age where we have such a much more up close and personal relationship with the world, right? Through our media technology, through, we're connecting on other sides of the planet right now. And with that new intimacy comes a new type of relationship, right? There's a new type of relationship that we're having with the world. And it definitely comes with challenges, right? With heartache and with stress and with like a weight. But there's also an opportunity in this closeness to be part of this time of transformation in, big ways, but also I think And so many of us are doing this already. You're doing it with your podcast, in my humble view, in everyday ways with how we show up, how we live our values, and how we feel called to be of service in our own unique ways. And so that's what I've been really grateful to get to learn from and be part of.
Yeah, just thinking there's so much we can go from there on. Let's start with this. Like, you call yourself, or you find yourself a very empathetic person, right? And people see that you are that sort type of person, and hence they're willing to come up to you and share their life story because they feel very comfortable that you won't be judging them, that you'll be coming from that point of seeking to understand and seeking to essentially relate to them. And so I'm really keen to, first of all, explore this empathy side of things in terms of how you show up with it, how you maintain it, how you stay in this sort of empathetic state to be able to better connect at a deeper level. Because empathy is ultimately the way in which we connect at the deepest level. And you obviously have that, whether it be innate or just who you are. But I'm really keen to explore this subject as to how this has come about in you and how you nourish it, how you nurture it.
Mm. How many hours do we have? How much time do we have? This is such a great question. And it's actually been a theme I've been chewing on for years, but I've actually been putting out some content about recently. And it's this question that I've been holding in my own heart of how to become exquisitely good. And no, actually, I don't even want to say the word good. I want to say exquisitely skilled at giving. And exquisitely skilled, which, giving at the heart of it is empathy. For so many of us, and I really do think of it as an orientation. There are some of us who are naturally other oriented or naturally sensitive to others. And what's cool is that there is research and evidence base that shows this too, that we all fall in a spectrum when it comes to empathy. There are some of us who are just naturally more sensitive, and even some of us who fall into the highly sensitive category. And then there's others of us who are just born more stoic, right? Emotionally stoic. And there's no right or wrong, good or bad. I honestly think about it similarly to the way if somebody is just born naturally athletic, right? They're just born in their body, or they have a certain kind of muscle mass or build. In order to actualize those gifts, they need to train, right? They need to take care of their body. They need to eat right, etc. And of course, we all need to do that too. But I think with an orientation like an empath or a sensitive soul, or whatever terminology we want to use around it, because emotions have been so taboo culturally for so long, actually acknowledging that there are some of us out there who just are more naturally sensitive, and then equipping ourselves and each other and supporting each other to become really healthy versions of that is something I feel really passionate about. Yeah, I'll pass the ball to you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that you see like in today's world where it's very, I must say, survival oriented, because we're so uncertain and we're fearing the future with there's so much instability around us, whether that be geopolitical, whether it be financial. And like I'm just thinking with the rising cost of living and the uncertainty around interest rates and fuel prices and all that. And so people are, concerned about where the next meal is going to come from, how they're going to pay the mortgage and rent. And so in this survival state, we're very, I guess, self-oriented, because if we aren't, then we don't survive, right? So it's a challenging time to be really caring of others, and probably why we don't see so much of it today. I mean, in certain ways we do, if it's extreme, like so if like you see these GoFundMes where people can really empathize at the deepest level and they just give a lot. But unless you're in those extreme cases, the average person that's not in that extreme situation isn't getting all that support and love and, from the community. We certainly have it within us, but it's sort of at the moment a bit sporadic as to how we care and give and connect with others. So I'm just thinking, how do you stay in this empathetic state to be mindful of others, yet caring of yourself? Because that's essential too. Yeah. So I'm just really interested in helping others to better connect ultimately when we're seeking to understand as opposed to seeking to transact.
Yeah.
And typically our world today is very transactional, not relational. Relational is that where empathy, surrounds it. But, the transaction is very much that capitalism, very much that doing, seeking external validation, seeking prizes and all that sort of stuff, accomplishments. Yeah. So really keen to how you can help the listeners sort of be able to step into that more understanding, empathetic state and to better ultimately relate and connect with others.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you bringing that perspective in, especially around the survival piece. And, I think the first step starts with ourselves and starts with making sure that we're well resourced enough to be able to reach out to others. I mean, we got to put our own oxygen mask on before helping the person next to us. And I think in a world or in certain cultural settings and also within, like you mentioned, the cost of living is rising. There's a lot of anxiety and stress about the future livability of the planet. There's a lot of change going on, even with our media landscape and how that's affecting our teenagers or whatever it might be, right? The list goes on. Within all of that, there can really be the need to first step in and create space for ourselves around how this is all affecting us, right? It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If the basics aren't met, then we're not going to be able to step into these other ways of being. I think that we also live at a time where compassion fatigue is also very real. I never want to make assumptions about people or about listeners, but I would imagine at some point within the last several years, many of your listeners have been swept in or pulled into different news stories or different current events or even things going on in their own neighborhoods, their own communities, their own families, right? That pulled at their heartstrings or that they really felt such a strong connection to and care about. And it can be exhausting to do that, right? And especially in this day and age when we're inundated with so much. And there are also so many layers to tend to, right? From our own personal worlds, our family systems, community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the first step that I recommend and suggest and that I utilize for myself is really, how full is my own cup? How full is my own cup? How well resourced am I? And even developing a self-awareness within myself of where if my bandwidth is lower, then I can't expect as much out of myself. I think about it sometimes with consuming the news or reading the news, right? I have made it a practice for myself to really notice, okay, Liz, you want to read this news article about what's going on in Iran, for instance, right? Well, let's make sure that you have enough time and space to actually take it in and notice what you notice as you do, as opposed to, flashing through it in between calls or as I'm shoveling food in my mouth, during lunch. Because when I do that, I notice that I'm more grumbly, right? Like I'm shorter with my kid. And so I really think just naming the emotional impact that caring about others, caring about ourselves, caring about the world has is such a strong and needed starting point, because from there we can start building not only self-awareness, but a self-compassion for ourselves. Because to your point, the relational, like empathy is tied to relationality, and something that I know I've struggled with myself and I see in the communities that I'm part of is that these modern times, and whether it be the transactional nature or the fast-paced nature, production, whatever we want to chalk it up to, leaves so many of us really feeling empty or feeling lost and really, seeking something, whether it is community-based or it's spiritual or whatever it might be for each of us. And this is where being able to reach out and connect, right? Connection, again, whether it's with others or with the earth and the sun or with, something greater than oneself, can come into play.
Yeah, it's that real sense of belonging. I belong here. You know, I'm I'm connected ultimately, ultimately we're seeking to be that feeling at one with everything. So connected with everyone, connected with everything, and to feel that we're just united. And I think, well, certainly the division comes through that judgment piece, where and that judgment is, I guess, profound when we're in survival mode because we're assessing the world from that. Is this a threat to me or is it safe?
Mm,
And, and that's a primal instinct because first, as you said, first of all, we got to feel safe in order to thrive. If we're not safe, then no point of worrying about thriving. We've got to survive. And,
right.
and so we're constantly, I think, being pushed down to this survival level from the media because they're constantly showing the doom and gloom in the world, right? And so
Right.
we're constantly suppressed into this survival way of living or thinking, and it's so hard to ultimately then think about others when we're suppressed. And I like what you share is that first of all, you need to have that, that connection with self, that looking after self, because it's so much hard. Like if you don't love yourself, then it's really difficult to love anything really. Like it's because if you're
Yes.
loathing this, that self-loathing, and we get a lot of that through social media and comparison, and so I'm really keen to explore this building this self love as well, because I think it's foundational to be able to then, be beyond that sort of survival state. Is, I really love myself. And when we love ourselves, we care for ourselves. When we don't love ourselves, we won't care for ourselves. We do things to sabotage ourselves. So I'm really keen to talk about this thing of, nourishing the self love in times of really a lot of, like I mentioned before, that a lot of that survival state of thinking.
Mm. I feel such tenderness in that too, which I so appreciate. Just that self-love being such a tender, rich topic because, and it even makes me think of your earlier question of empathy and, where that comes from or how to work with that. And it actually even makes me think that within my own story, parts of my empathy was actually used as a survival mechanism when I was very young. Right? Like as young kids are so perceptive because we have to be in order to survive. And I know for me, it was something that I could leverage, right? To stay safe, to, navigate situations, to sense into things. And so it makes me just think about how we're born with different versions of that, of where, and, we all come from all sorts of different circumstances and families and backgrounds. But when I come into my own spiritual sense, because I'm personally just a spiritual person, of why, right? What is the deeper why for being born into a certain family situation or a certain cultural context, or even this time that we live in right now? There is something within me that feels such purpose to it in terms of spiritual development, in terms of growth, in terms of that journey of self-love and returning to something, returning to whatever that might be, belonging, connection, source within self, source beyond, etc. And so coming to that more practical exploration of, it brings me just to my heart, to this tender space. And it brings me back to this really just first stepping stone of self compassion and zooming out and really finding ways to support oneself to do what's really hard work. The practice and the work of turning inward and looking at, again, because I'm going to bring this back to the empathy piece. I think, oh, I'm empathetic. I'm a giver. I'm a helper, right? And I smell some savior complex in there. Smell ways that it gets me into tricky situations of where someone didn't ask for my help, but I'm asserting myself, right? There's all sorts of, unhealthy versions that can come with any sets of traits. And so for me, part of my journey has been really getting honest with myself about that and really seeing patterns that have shown up in my life where I'm like, oof, this showed up again. What does that mean? And one of the things that I know has been part of my journey and that is very typical is that shame can really keep us from looking inward and being honest with ourselves about these kind of things. And it's a very effective coping mechanism, right? To keep ourselves safe in many ways or keep ourselves surviving and moving. But for those of us who are at a point in our lives and in our journeys where we have both the inner resources and the outer resources in terms of emotionally safe others, right? Whether that is a partner, whether that's a family member, a therapist, a counselor, whatever it might be, who can sit with us and validate what we're feeling, help us really stay supported and grounded as we unpack or look at different edges within us that can help us continue to clean up, but then also clarify that path of self-love. And so I think without all of that, we can't really show up for our families. We can't show up for these times. But I do think that these times are even inviting us into that self-love journey even more so. And so there's something very ripe and beautiful about that.
I love how you mentioned that in order to discover that, we need to go within, and that can be really challenging, right? I've got to face my demons. I've got to face everything I can't sit with, and hence why, I'm always running away from it, essentially being busy. But, when you're still and you got to sit with your thoughts and process it, what was the driving factor that really just stopped you and I got to work with this as opposed to resist it and keep running away? So I'm really keen to find out how you broke that cycle.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that I am emotionally sensitive was actually advantageous to me in this, of where from a very early age, I realized, oof, I am either going to get eaten alive or I'm going to learn how to lace up my shoes and dance because, I come from a family that's full of strength and beauty and love, as well as addiction and abuse and, intergenerational trauma that I really also feel blessed to have been able to see, to be able to zoom out and see just ways that the patterns I was seeing in myself, saw were inherited by, my family and, my grandparents and all this other stuff. And so, I mean, there's so many points along the ways. And honestly, there still continues to be points. You know what I mean? It's one of the reasons why I love doing this work because to the way that I feel called into this work is through authenticity and through, relationships, you know what I mean? Like building relationships with people and, and even, figuring out in this divisive time how to be online, which is like, I retreated for so many years. I was like, it's savage out there. I don't know, y'all. But, getting clearer on who I am, getting clearer even on, again, for me being an empath, there's a porousness to it. And so continuing to develop the skills within myself to really, center into home base in my body and my mind and my heart, and even really recognize, okay, I'm here, you're there. That's your story. That's not my story. Right. And just building these tools of sovereignty that have supported me just in terms of my own natural orientation to be able to show up better and And it's so interesting too, because I was thinking about this the other day. For so long, my like empathy tools were a lot around like outward things. Like I was like, oh, I need to build this imaginary bubble around me that will keep people out or whatever it might be. But the actual tools that have been the most lasting in, my more recent years have actually just been about rooting more deeply into myself, rooting more deeply into my heart, into my sense of self, which I think also comes from even being in, I have an amazing relationship with my husband, which I'm so fortunate for, and that we've done a lot of big work on doing. And so I think all of those kind of home base type things have really been helpful.
And how do you do that in terms of deepening that relationship with self? And is it something you put aside time for? And how do you go about doing it? Like, so, some people it's, meditating and then reflecting and journaling and things like that. How do you better understand yourself and how do you go about that? I guess continuing to do the great work you do, but also discovering yourself. So is it something that you just constantly work on, by having a schedule or, yeah, I'm just really keen and curious as to how you go about doing it.
Yeah, for me, meditation's been a really big part of it. And honestly, meditation is such a broad category of practices. And so it's looked different for me over time. I also, and this ties to the meditation piece, but I spent a lot of years in therapy in a particular type of therapeutic modality called AEDP, which is an acronym for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. And that is a very emotion centered therapeutic approach. It's a lot around healing attachment trauma. So, for those who aren't familiar, our very early relationships essentially imprint attachment patterns on us that then we carry with us throughout our lives and really shape the other types of relationships we enter into and what we think is normal or tolerate and, very much shapes our own sense of self too. And so that kind of therapeutic space and healing space, which was very relational, very experiential. So very different even from, psychoanalysis, which is a lot around, and my husband's a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist too. So we do a lot of this nerdy healing centered pillow talk, which has helped me deepen my understanding of it too. But, in analysis, the therapist's role is very much a blank slate, right? It's very much about, your own projections onto that person and exploring it that way. Whereas ADP and some of these more relational models of therapy, it's more about what's in the room with us right here, right? What's coming up? It's very much about the dynamic between me and the therapist. And it's actually the ways that I've been trained and bring into coaching work that I do, of where it's very much about, instead of analyzing the emotion that you're feeling or even tying it to a behavior and trying to change the behavior, it's actually around using tools, somatic tools and relational tools like our connection right here to support the person to actually feel what they're feeling and allow that emotion to come forward and allow the shame to subside in order for the emotion to come forward, in order for it to live out its full wave. Because what's so cool about emotions, especially our core emotions like anger and fear and sadness, is that evolutionarily speaking, or the evolutionary perspective on them, is that they're baked with intelligence around what we need to survive and thrive and just how to adapt to our environment. And so those have been really profound for me, that type of healing space that is so emotion centered. And again, I think especially for me, as somebody who's emotional, right? Emotion centered and a feeler, to actually not only have space that permissions and supports and validates, but even has helped me to form healthier relationships with my own inner world and, heal ways that it's like, oh, I'm too much, right? Or I'm, whatever it might be, all those different things. And then I'll also just throw in there like movement and dance and just finding ways to express myself. But yeah, the AADP therapy is definitely has been super profound for me.
And everything you just mentioned are forms of mindfulness.
Yes.
And I think part of what we and yeah, I think it's changing, but certainly that whole some people say I can't meditate, therefore I can't be mindful or whatever. But as you mentioned, there's so many variations, and it's like a journey. Like you can become mindful in everything you do. Like you can be mindful on this podcast. It's where your presence, right? Essentially, and that's what it's calling upon is more presence and stop going into the past and stop going into the future and just be here present. And I've just love how you've mentioned all the various forms of mindfulness that you do in order to maintain this presence. And, when we're present, we're connected with self, where we can be more connected with others. It's when we jump into the past and future is where we get, uncertain or, we're living past experiences and bringing up those emotions. But in the presence, we're here now. And it's quite neutral in terms of emotional health. It's just, we can run into the future and get elated about what we could accomplish, or we can run in the past and be traumatized or, feel the trauma from the past. Whereas when we're present, it's just the now and very neutral. It's very, I guess, we can feel ourselves. We can
Mm.
feel, yeah, feel others, feel their energy, be able to connect with where they're at. Yeah. So, I is there any other forms of meditation, mindfulness that you've discovered that have really helped your sense of being?
Mm. Yeah, what's coming to mind is that I totally agree with what you're saying around how the present moment and even presence is just at the heart of mindfulness. And I know for me too, actually, because what I've experienced in my life and my journey too is that part of the thing that has kept me away or takes me away from being present is actually almost like intruding thoughts from the past related to the past, or intruding thoughts and worries about the future. And for me, what I've needed within my own journey is actually to create constructive space for those worries or for that trauma so that it can reveal things to me. And trauma in particular, the definition that I use for it is it's anything that was too much, too fast, too soon for me at that time in my life to be able to process and handle on my own. And so I got really creative in the moment and I exiled it from my conscious awareness. And it's not until I'm actually at a point in my life where I'm resourced enough within and without and have that real emotional safety of another person that it's able to come back into view and really be unpacked and let that emotional energy live out its full wave. And so for me, I've really appreciated having the space to do that. And, I think about the kind of future worries a lot too. And, I've done a lot of work on climate change and just climate anxiety and everything like that. And, I've been in activist or change maker circles where it's very much like, okay, yeah, there's climate anxiety, but let's push it aside. We got to keep moving, right? We got to, organize the next event. We've got to, advocate for that policy, whatever it might be. But I'm of the mind that actually by creating space for that climate anxiety, not just acknowledging it and then pushing it away or regulating it to control it, but actually, although of course there's a time and place for these things, but I really am wholeheartedly a believer in having dedicated constructive space for these things, for these feelings, for these experiences, for these inner rumblings and turmoils and just even the felt senses of things, even the things that we feel opportunity and possibility around, right? That are kind of like formless and swirling within us, because it's then that they reveal things to us, right? When they're actually supported and we can use, again, what we know from the healing centered sciences and clinical psychology and neuroscience to support these things, they, fears of the future in particular, they can show us what's important to us now, right? Like what we value, what we love, what we care about. And then, we can bring that into our lives more. We can be like, yeah, right. My fear of, losing these trees actually just show me how much I love these trees. And so I'm going to spend, you know, 10 minutes, right? It doesn't even have to be a big thing every day, just taking a walk by those trees or just sitting under that tree, right? It can inform how we live our lives now, which, yeah, I can feel it in the back of my heart right now. It just feels like where it's at.
And you're mentioning that appreciation and gratitude, and that's very much a present state. It's beautiful to see how you actually put aside the time to deal with this stuff as opposed to just pushing it, kicking the can down the road. They say it's really nice that you actually create the space to deal with future worries or past concerns. How do you then obviously you create the space, but how do you get into a state to be able to deal with it? Because obviously if you can set aside the time, but you might you might enter that time in a real frazzled state, and hence you just can't deal with that additional load, right? So what's your prep in leading into that, dealing with it and working on it? And do you do this work through the technique you mentioned, or do you do it with someone else, or how do you actually do the work?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So what's cool is, again, we have so much information about how emotions work in the mind and body. And so everything that I teach through We Heal for All and facilitate and offer is rooted in all those things. And then also what I practice myself. And so the first thing that's really key is, and we've been bringing it up throughout our conversation, is really that safety. Feeling safe enough to slow down, feeling safe enough to go there in terms of different parts of yourself. And that can really look like, if I'm doing this kind of practice on my own, it can look like just shutting a door, right? It can look like turning off my phone. It can look like, sometimes for me, it's like making sure my windows are shut so no one's hearing me or, right? It's just like maybe a little bit more privacy. But especially for bigger emotions or more overwhelming emotions, really having an emotionally safe other is really necessary and helpful. And so one of the main offerings that I have is a circle model that uses meditation and storytelling and resonance practice, which is a form of embodied empathy, to support people to come together in a community setting and really both connect with self, right? Slow down enough to connect with self. Because again, like we've been talking about, life's busy, right? It's hectic. It keeps us going and going and going. So even that practice of slowing down and having this very intentional space, right? Like I step into this circle knowing that this is a space to slow down and connect with myself is powerful and helpful. And we can think about it even like if you join a yoga class. And again, there's so many different kinds of yoga classes out there, but we're into a meditation space, going and moving into a sangha or an ashram, right? There's the intention of the space helps to guide one's energy. And so what we do then in Circle is also, and this is really the heart and soul of it, is we spend time after, connecting with ourselves through meditation and really grounding into our body and even giving a chance to, you know, let go of the day, let go of what we're carrying in with us and really even being slow in our practice of slowing down and compassionate too, right? It's not like, oh, I'm just going to slow down and now I'm here, right? There's going to be resistance that comes up. There's going to be the to-do list that's still barking in the background. And that's all okay, right? This is all just experimentation and practice and play. And we're here just to learn and deepen that self-love, right? Deepen that self-awareness. And so then the rest of our time is really this storytelling. And I got to find a better word for it because it's really not, stories with beginning, middle, and end. It's really this practice of connecting with ourselves and speaking from this emotional presence and really sharing. And again, it doesn't even need to have words sometimes, but just putting form to some of these inner stirrings and formlessness. And there's two main tools that we use. And again, this is specific to a group setting, but they have principles that carry over. And the one are a set of guidelines for listening and sharing. And they're less of a set of rules and more about a group of practices that we agree as a community of relational practices, if you will, that we're like, okay, we're going to try to do these with each other. So it's things like even just taking our intention to listen with compassion seriously. It's around not engaging in crosstalk after someone shares, right? Even though there's like a beautiful intention to it, or not giving unsolicited advice. That's another one too, right? Even though it comes from such a good place, right? I want to help. Oh, I know exactly what you need, right? It actually, what we know about emotions, it can actually really shut down emotions, or can make a person feel very misunderstood, or, right? And so there's these tools to support this kind of openness and support this kind of connection. And then the other one is this resonance practice, which is anytime my own emotions and inner sensations respond to what you're saying, I let you know by putting my hand on my heart, wiggling my fingers, right? It's a way to keep my listening active and tuned into myself, as well as kind of giving the gift back to the listener that, like, yeah, I feel you. I'm right there with you. Right. And it's that connection. It's that support. It's almost this like neural network that gets created within this community space that can really support the flow and the processing, the movement of emotional energy. And so it's a real practice of kind of dropping rehearsed scripts, right? Dropping like, oh, okay, this is what, again, let's take climate change. This is what I'm supposed to say. Or even, like, oh, I've been rehearsing this story all day about what I want to say, and really dropping into, okay, what's present for me right now? And do I feel safe enough and supported enough? Little tears just only came to my eyes to share, to bring it forward. And so yeah, those, ingredients, right, of safety, of somatic and relational connection. And even we can provide that for ourselves, being that warm voice in our own head when we do notice that the to-do list is barking in the background or whatever it is, right? Making it a little bit of a safer space within our own minds and bodies to slow down. And so yeah, I'll pause there because I could just keep going.
No, it's a fantastic segue into how can the listeners find this community? How can they connect with you? So please share your details for the listeners.
Yeah. So you can find me through my website. It's wehealforall.com. These days, I don't have any scheduled circles right now. I typically have a calendar of circles that I like to offer because I am been focusing on my book. I published a book this past October, and I'm about to release the audiobook this fall here in this, on the fall calendar with here in the States. And so that's my focus. I'm also expecting baby number 2 this winter. So there's just, family and life, but I have a Substack and just love to connect with people too through social media. And so that's the way that people can find me.
Fantastic. I'll include all those links in the show notes, listeners, so you can go directly to the show notes and connect with Liz. Liz, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom of the great work you're doing out there to make us feel more connected.
It has been such a pleasure. Thank you for the space that you held and this amazing platform that you built.
You're welcome. And thank you, listeners, for continuing to tune in to the Joyful Mate podcast each week. And stay tuned for more insightful episodes of Joyful Mate.